Well, thank you, team, and it's so amazing to join you here at the Dezrez conference. Today, we're going to talk a lot about the future of the world. We're going to talk about what we can do inside of the digital environment, and we're going to talk about the emergence of the new world customer. I want to start with a couple of quotes to kind of get you thinking, and you know what, we're going to start with a really important idea, and it's one by Patrick Laconi. He says, if you can get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you can dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. And this is about the evolution of the brand new world. You see, the purpose of learning today is not about affirming our beliefs, it really is about evolving our beliefs. And today I want to get you to start to think about that we need a huge evolution around our beliefs about what it takes to be a great estate agency. This is a whole conversation too, and I love this quote by Jim Collins, that there will be no new normal. There will only be a series of conditions that are not normal episodes, defying prediction that is unforeseen by most of us until ultimately they already happen. And that means doubling down on the first two principle, which is that if you're going to climb a big, scary mountain against unexpected obstacles, then you better make sure that you've got the right partners that are on the other end of the rope. People who can adapt to whatever you encounter to actually make sure that we can scale the mountain. Even the most visionary among us cannot always predict the ideas that will work. And I love this as an idea. And I love to start our conversation this way because what I know is that in the new digital world, there is simply no excuse for being detached, for being removed, for being distant, or for simply just being uninvolved. This new era is calling us into a position that we need to live in the world that our questions create. And throughout the course of my presentation today, I want to give you some big questions to ultimately go and answer. What we know is that this is a new era, one where ultimately the customer expects no friction, one where they expect everything to be able to be digitally done, whether or not that's signing an estate agency agreement, whether or not it's exchanging on a contract, whether or not it's putting in an application for a tenancy, whether or not it's the conversation around how they give feedback inside of your organization. The digital era is forcing us to fundamentally change the way that we work as human beings. You see, at the end of the day, we live two worlds. We've got a real life. That real life is the human experience. It's the touch and the feel. It's the here and the now. It's about you and me right now being able to have that conversation around what's really going on for you, about how you're feeling. It's about your emotions, that whole conversation. And you can have an incredibly dynamic real life, yet ultimately have no digital life whatsoever. We then see the opposite of influencers in the digital world, particularly on social, having this whole conversation where they've got a massive fan base, they've got all of these friends, they've got over 10,000 people that are following them, yet ultimately they're fundamentally at home, lonely, on a Saturday night, on their own. And what's actually happening is that now we see the emergence of a third space where our real life and digital lives converge. And not only are they converging, they're actually colliding at rapid speed. And we now need to start to think more powerfully and differently about what we're going to be doing in the future of our lives. Over the course of the next 10 years, we know that the world is only going to speed up. And given that it's going to speed up, how are you planning on coping with that new level of speed? That then combined that the more successful that you become, the more that people are going to want to use you. And what are you planning on doing to be able to cope with that new level of demand? This new conversation is about learning how scale really fundamentally changes what happens inside of an organization. And this is the power of what digital does, is it allows us to scale our conversations to more consumers more often. We've seen it here happen inside of Australia. One of our clients all of a sudden makes the decision to do a Zoom meeting with every single one of their landlords involved. The conversation about what was actually happening during the COVID era, being able to get in front of all of their customers in a very short period of time to actually calm their nerves about the current set of conditions and what they would be doing to be incredibly proactive. That all of a sudden changed the game. For the first time ever, for that business owner, they were able to make sure that they could get in front of all 1,000 landlords that they represent in the marketplace in under a few minutes, and to be able to articulate a very powerful communicated message around what they're going to be doing into the future of the estate agency practice. There is no reason to be detached. There is no reason to be uninvolved. This is now the conversation about fundamentally shifting the entire way that we market and learning how to powerfully connect with our consumers in a very simple way. Now, this doesn't mean that we're not going to do face-to-face. It's quite the opposite. What technology is there to do is to enable us to do more of the human moments that really matter. But now we can operate at speed in a brand new world and how we go to connect both in the real world and in the digital life of our end consumers. How do we interact though, just before the customer needs us? New data is telling us that here in Australia, we can identify people's credit card purchases. So if someone's all of a sudden been down to the local hardware store and maybe they've bought that can of pink or blue paint, and at the same time too, they went down to the local baby store and they were in a position that all of a sudden they went to go and buy a new pram, then maybe we've identified that this particular consumer is in a position that they're buying blue or pink paint, and off the back of that, they're also in a position in a Google search that they're talking about, how to actually be a great parent with your first baby. And at the same time too, we then combine that with that Amazon purchase of that particular book. Then we go to have a look at how they're buying the pram. That identifies that this is now a consumer who's about to move. So let's start serving them digital content specifically that relates to their particular world. And this is what we're all expecting. You didn't even know that you needed to know that until all of a sudden you knew that, and then all of a sudden you made a very different decision around what it is that you're doing in terms of the power of real estate marketing. You see, real estate marketing is fundamentally shifted. This whole touting for business, putting something in someone's letterbox, hoping that it was actually going to go and hit the spot is no longer going to cut it. We actually need to make sure that in the real world, we know how to interact with customers at viewings, when they come into our branch offices, in the conversations that we have inside of our local villages. But most importantly, we also need to make sure that we're having just as dynamic conversations with the new data sets that are rapidly evolving. What we're actually starting to understand is that we live in something that we got to call the prediction economy. And everyone wants to buy it. We've got estate agents ultimately lining up out the doors for that new bit of kit, that new bit of software that all of a sudden tells them at a technology level that this is the consumer who's actually going to be next. We know that they're in a position that they've been looking at this property multiple times. We know that they've forwarded on to the friend. We know they've had a look at the video. We know they've had a look at the floor plan. We know they've downloaded the appropriate reports on that particular location. We know they're also looking at recent sales or recent let data on properties that have actually sold or let at a similar price point, which actually gives us an indication that they're ready to do a transaction themselves. This is all about understanding the digital intent. And what the prediction economy is all about understanding is ultimately who's next. Some of the amazing stats that come from Facebook is that they ultimately know 90 days out about who's going to be getting a divorce and who's not. They know who's going to be getting up as a couple together and who's not. They have an understanding about who you're most likely to try and date next based on the conversations around what you're doing in looking at the photos, in the comments, in the interactions, in the direct messaging. And this prediction economy, although scary, is ultimately the place that we need to understand what we can be doing to be more powerful in the way that we get to work with consumers. You see, everyone wants to know who's next. And we know that here in Australia, we've got estate agents that are prepared to forfeit 20% of their fee for these prediction companies, for these prediction technologies to tell them who's going to be the next customer, even though those customers are already sitting on the inside of their existing CRM. And this is fascinating to me because you know what? We actually don't even understand what the real world signs actually are. If a buyer turns up to a property to come through for a viewing, if we have a tape measure and they take that tape measure and they measure a wall and they come back for a second viewing and they bring their family members, we know that that is a real world scenario of someone who's actually looking forward to move forward in a purchase. And at a selling level, if someone's coming through at a purchase level, do we ask the very basic question, have you purchased locally before and what are your plans that are existing when you go to buy the next? These two simple questions fundamentally change the entire way that you do business. This is the idea that game-changing questions fundamentally shift everything that we do. And all we need to do is to understand what those real-world signs are. At the end of the day, our conversation is about learning how to work with people in a much more powerful way. And if we can't understand what the real-world signs are, what hope is there to try to digitize those particular moments in understanding what they might actually be in the digital world. Now, I'm fundamentally interested in this. It fundamentally shifts the entire way that we work. We know that literally the basics of human interactions haven't changed. The only difference in the digital world is that we are quickly and rapidly trying to understand what consumers actually do in that environment, which gives us an idea about what's actually happening in the real world. Now, Google can already tell us the conversation around what people are searching for. Are we turning up in the search results for what's critically important as a part of the conversation? What are the digital world signs though that actually show that there's real digital intent? Well, what we understand is that email is one of the most powerful digital marketing tools. You have a look at that on social media. Over 10,000 people might follow me on Instagram, but only 1,000 people will actually interact with that particular content. What I know specifically is that if I send out 10,000 emails to a carefully curated list, which is permission-based at an email level, over 33% of people will actually open that email. That's over 3,300 people that read that daily email each and every single day. And the reason why I send it out daily is that if those people actually put up their hand and say, you know what, I need some help here, man, then I now know that I can work with them in a really powerful space. What we know that fundamentally happens here, if someone's opening an email, if they're clicking on that particular link, if they're forwarding it to a friend, if they're reopening the email multiple times and using it as a reference document, it ultimately gives us a sign of their intention. Now, what we're seeing here is this whole new conversation about how we actually win the business at a negotiator level. What are we doing specifically at a valuer level to make sure that we can receive that instruction from every single one of our sellers or potential landlords? Now, this is fascinating to me. Why people want to go and send a proposal, because then when we get the proposal in the new digital environment, we can see that they spent 6 minutes reading the bit about your fees and only a minute looking at the comparable properties that have recently sold, which tells you that apparently in the digital world, there's a massive issue with what you're representing in terms of the fee environment, and maybe that's the thing that you should be following the customer up with. Now, I don't know if I fundamentally believe, because I think that a great valuer will actually be there in front of the customer doing the face-to-face conversation to win the instruction, and they will fundamentally know if there is a fee issue, if they have effectively trial closed. So please don't throw out all of the amazing things that we have actually learned in the real world because all of a sudden you think that the digital world is ultimately going to save you. What we know fundamentally is that ultimately the only reason that you're sending a proposal is because either you are weak inside of what you're doing with the customer, or there's a very specific situation that requires it. Maybe there's a bank foreclosure. Maybe there's multiple parties in a deceased estate scenario. Maybe you're dealing with an interstate or inter-country customer who actually you can't meet face-to-face with, who is an investor that you need to be able to send that digital environment report to. What we're trying to get you to think about is that digital intent fundamentally changes the way that we work with people. And not all technology is ultimately helpful, but there are some technologies that are fundamentally incredibly powerful. If, for example, we know that someone is in a position that they've looked at a property on your email, we can now serve that property back to that particular person. If they click on it a second, third, and fourth time, we know they've got real world intent about that particular home. If we can then identify that they've been to the major real estate portals, that they've looked at recent sales that are below by a few £100,000, well, that clearly identifies that they have something to sell and they're looking to particularly buy at this particular region. That identifies digital intent. Therefore, that's the next person on the call list. And this is the foundational piece that fundamentally shifts the entire way that we work. You see, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're very, very focused around how we actually understand what customers are doing and what we need to do next. But the power is ultimately in still picking up the phone and amplifying more of the human moments. You see, this is the whole conversation, the difference between conversion campaigns and awareness campaigns. Now, the interesting conversation here is that most businesses spend all their time, money, energy, and marketing around awareness campaigns. We get a massive hot air balloon, we fly it over central London, all of a sudden everyone is aware of our particular brand, but does that actually move into real world conversion? Probably not. And you can have the most incredible brand, but if people don't actually relate to what it is that you do, then that is a huge challenge. Now, we had a massive UK brand come out here to Australia. They spent over $19 million in marketing their particular brand, and in under 18 months, they'd packed their bags and had returned to the UK. And the reason is that if your business model does not relate to what consumers want, if you fundamentally don't solve the key problems that they've got, there is no way that you can be powerful into the future. Now, what does conversion look like? Let's say, for example, that your team was out there as a negotiator and they were working with all of those particular people that had come to do a viewing on a particular home. And let's say they did 10 viewings on that particular property. Out of those 10 people that came for a viewing, how many of them are in a position that they already own locally? How many of them are out of area owners? How many of those people were landlords, and how many of those people were actually first home buyers? And then how many of them have we been able to move into that instruction meeting, what we call a lap? How many were we able to move into a valuation meeting, what we call a map? And how many of them will be able to move into a buyer appointment, a BAP, which obviously you guys get to call a viewing? You see, the secret here is about understanding where the conversion campaigns exist in business. Now, if I was highly critical of what I've seen inside of the UK, if I can see where the biggest opportunity for growth is, it is without a doubt with all of the existing past clients that already exist on the inside of your business. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the thing that just amazes me is the person who buys the property often negotiates with the negotiator. They never get to meet the valuer. And the highest turnover rate of any position inside of any estate agency firm that we've ever worked with is usually in the negotiator roles. So the person who has a relationship and the chance to build the relationship with the buyer when they buy, who will become a future seller, ultimately leaves the estate agency industry and goes, and no one actually goes to build a relationship with the past client. This has got to change, because in the real world, it's actually about the conversion campaigns. So what would happen if a dentist became an estate agent? They would move into annual checkups pretty quickly. They'd get on the phone. Hi Hannah, it's Josh Phegan calling. The reason for my call today: congratulations, you've owned your property for another year. How are things with you? Looking for dissatisfaction. How's the house? Looking for dissatisfaction. And off the back of that, would it be of value for us to pop out to give you an idea on what it's worth, so then you can make some better decisions for the future? This is such a simple call. If someone lives in a house over the course of 5 years, and we're in a position that maybe there's a £2,000 fee, depending on which area you're operating across the UK. That to me actually tells you that every single time that you go out to go and see that particular client for an annual checkup, that's effectively £400 that you're going to have the opportunity to earn. However, the funds won't be paid until they do the transaction in 5 years' time. This is the way of changing the view of how we're going to serve customers in much more powerful ways. And we can do it through digital intent as well, by sending a great email, by sending great SMSs, by using chatbots that allow us to have really powerful conversations with people that identifies that particular cookie, that particular email address, so we know exactly what it is that they're doing next. You see, the whole world has gone crazy with this understanding that now the most powerful thing that actually happens is customer experience and the definition of what it is that we do. Now, customer experience couldn't be more blatant than what actually happens here in Australia. You go to a local cafe or restaurant, you walk into some locations and you say, hello, would it be okay if I have some water? And they say, sure, the tap's over there, man. Go get your own glass, fill it yourself, and good luck with that. Yet there are other cafes and other restaurants that you go to. When you walk in, they say, welcome, sir. Quick question, would you like some sparkling or would you like some still water? And all of a sudden you say, you know what, I'd love some sparkling, and bang, £8 has all of a sudden been added to your bill just like that. These organizations are really clear about what the definition is of service. And I can tell you what, the organization that literally is go get your own water, man, good luck with that, has no care whatsoever for the fine dining restaurant in relation to the sparkling water around what it is that we did. And what we fundamentally got wrong, if I have a look at what we did over the course of the last 10 years, was allowing the whole conversation between high street versus online estate agency, when in fact we had nothing to do with what we were doing for the end customer. If someone has a great experience, what do? They go and tell other people about it. And what the digital world does is allows us to add strategic fuel to rapidly allow that story to be told to more consumers more often. That is what we got to call word of mouth marketing. It still exists today. George Silverman's book, The Power of Word of Mouth Marketing, written in 1960, couldn't even be more relevant than anything else that's come out, because it ultimately talks about what it is that we do is all around providing that experience. But the customer experience doesn't just start with the customer. The customer experience actually starts with our staff. And if you look at any of Tom Peters' most recent work, he'll tell you that the number one most important thing inside of any business today is always about the people. If we look after our people, they look after the service. If we look after the service, it looks after the customer. If we look after the customer, it looks after the profit. If we look after the profit, it looks after the reinvestment. If we look after the reinvestment, that looks after the reinvention. If we look after the reinvention, then ultimately that looks after the future. And this is what we're talking about. Technology is about enablement. It's not about disablement. It's not about replacing estate agents. It's about changing the way that we fundamentally work so that we can be more powerful in what it is that we do. And digital must simply amplify the human moments so that we can actually be better, so that we can be faster, so we can remove the friction inside of the transaction. Now, this to me is absolutely fascinating because it's about understanding how we can use digital to fundamentally change the way that we think about workflow. And I got to tell you, I got it wrong. 2 or 3 years ago, if you had have told me that there was a need for a digital agency agreement, for digital contracts of sale, for the actual exchange of those particular properties, for digital leases, for the conversations around that, I would have said to you that you were crazy. I was happy with the carbon copy. To be honest, I was happy with able to being press hard and get 2 copies, one for the customer and one for me. But all of a sudden, the world rapidly changed. This is even pre-COVID. What we worked out very quickly is that digital workflow could actually speed up the things that could happen inside of a state agency. No longer do we have to be driving from one village to the next at 10:30 p.m. at night to be able to have a buyer to be able to sign a contract of sale. No longer do we have to be going out to go and see one particular customer 400 or so miles on a completely different side of the UK in order to be able to go and get them to sign an estate agency agreement. We now know that we can do it in a digital way, and it fundamentally has been able to improve the speed of which the customers work. Now, this is striking because it happened directly for one of my customers over the Christmas New Year period. Interesting conversation. On Christmas Eve, a buyer makes the decision to make an offer. The seller says we'd like to accept the offer. The buyer gets their copy of the digital contract and signs it, and you wouldn't believe it, but at 12:02 a.m., very late at the night or very early in the morning on Christmas Day, the seller is in a position that they signed the contract digitally and everything was actually exchanged. All of a sudden, the best Christmas present of all, the valuer wakes up, the negotiator wakes up, the business owner wakes up, and all of a sudden we see there's been another transaction that has already happened on Christmas Day, even though every single one of our physical offices is closed. This is what digital workflow is all about. It's about speeding up consumers to being able to allow them to be able to interact and to be able to do that transaction exactly when they'd like to do it. What we've seen here in Australia is massive evolutions. Digital agency agreements now account for close to 80% of the transactions down in Melbourne. In addition to that, contracts of sale are now exchanged at rapid warp speed. And in addition to that, every single time that happens, all of the parties that need to know about those things are notified. They're notified through great new technologies like Slack and Microsoft Teams. They're notified via email. They can be notified via SMS. Every single party and stakeholder, whether it be our solicitors and lawyers, right the way through to both parties, the buyer, the seller, the agent, the valuer, the negotiator, everyone receives that notification at exactly the right time. You know what? I can do everything else in my life. I can organize my healthcare. I can book in for my dentist online. I can be in a conversation. I can order a black cab. I can get an Uber. I can download training on demand and click play. Everything can be done directly from a mobile phone. So why can't we do that on the inside of the estate agency? The inside of the estate agency industry needs to rapidly change. It's time to incredibly evolve and to actually take ourselves into the future. Digital communication is changing the way that we work. We need to think internal communication tools to speed up the flow, to speed up the automation, and to speed up the notification of what we go to call critical events. Now, in our business, we made the decision to rapidly change. We've always had the philosophy as though we were running our business directly from one of the beautiful beaches in France. And what I worked out very quickly is that we needed to have a system of communication. Inside of our business, our systems of communication is very simple. If there's an emergency, if something really serious has gone down, then my team know they SMS me. If we're in a position that just something is happening through the day that is non-time dependent, that I can find out about at the end of the day, they'll send an internal message on the inside of Slack. And inside of Slack, I see every single thing that they've been working on throughout the course of the day, not only based on what they tell me, but based on what's actually happening inside of the software. And the software is here to eat the world and fundamentally to eat the jobs that are no longer important. And fundamentally, we're reshifting the entire way that we work. Now, why is this so critically important? I used to think about the power of human relationships. I used to think about every single day that I would speak to Kylie, my head of sales, and I would say to her, we've done the work today. Did we send the invoice and have we received the payment? I now no longer need to do that because when I jump into Slack, my invoicing software tells me that the invoice has gone out. My payment software tells me that the payment has been made. And fundamentally, it all happens very quickly. That doesn't mean that Kylie and I don't speak. We now speak every single business day, but every single thing that we talk about is about the more human connection, the value that we bring to the world, the things that we need to change more strategically so we can be operating more at the strategic level rather than fundamentally playing down at the bottom of the game, what we go to call the tactical. Now, this is interesting because the world's changing. And rapidly, this conference couldn't have come at a better time. In fact, it probably should have come another 5 years earlier because what we know is the future is all in the data lake. Sitting inside of your estate agency practice, we have millions of pounds worth of business that's out there for you to go and get that you're simply just leaking out the front door. And this is the whole conversation around what is a data lake and how do we fundamentally go and play with it in a much more powerful way. Now, we know that you've got all of those buyer details, you've got all of those landlord details, you've got all of those tenants details, you're in a position that you've actually got all of the seller details, and all of them are probably sitting in some sort of form of a reasonably average CRM, or if at best at that, there's maybe a sales CRM and a PM CRM, and never the two shall talk. Well, you know what? The world has fundamentally changed, because when you go to think about that, you've got all of these data points, but how do you actually bring it together? The sales CRM, the PM CRM, your social media CRM need to all be in one place. And this is about understanding that if Josh Phegan is interacting with you at a social level, then how do we fundamentally know that that's actually happening inside of our CRM and how we can go to serve the customer in a more powerful way? In our organization, we're experimenting with new technology that actually allows us to do this. What we did a few years ago is that we installed an app on our website called Intercom. Intercom connected directly with our CRM, which we happen to use Salesforce. And off the back of that, that then connects in with Recurly, which actually tells us everything that consumers are doing in terms of buying and selling products and services for us. Now, they're not estate agency specific, but I want to give you an idea about how fast the technology is moving. Now, all of a sudden, when someone comes onto our website and requests a new link on a particular thing or has a question about a particular product or service that we provide, in under seconds, the customer internally, being my staff, ultimately goes into Intercom. They have a quick look at that customer. Their profile is automatically pulled from Salesforce. We can see from Recurly what invoices they've actually paid, if there's any bad credit card debt, if there's any challenges with that particular customer, together with any notes, what events they've already experienced, whether or not they're a key customer of ours or not, and whether or not they're connected. And all of that happens in under a millisecond and sits there as one view. This is not hyperbole. This is not a conversation around where things could go. This is actually happening now in the real world. In one of our digital events, we had over 800 people log on in under the space of a few seconds. You can imagine real estate agents at their best. You know, their volume wasn't working. They couldn't see the screen. Turns out they didn't have their computer on and they didn't have the volume up. All of a sudden, we had to provide all that level of service, and 3 people in my business delivered that experience in milliseconds in the way that we interacted with customers in the digital world through live chat. This is fundamentally changing and we need to get better. The future of business is about going deeper with your existing customer base, learning how to serve them in new and powerful ways. It's about increasing the size, but most importantly about increasing the frequency of the existing customer spend. How do we get our landlords to buy that next new home? How do we have the conversation with them about whether or not they wanted to get us out to get a valuation on their existing principal place of residence? Whilst everyone's tied up in what's happening inside of the digital world, I'm looking for the massive opportunities about how we serve customers in new and better ways, and how we actually not just look at artificial intelligence, but most importantly, we look at intelligence augmented, where we get more and powerful data that allows me as a human to make much better quality decisions. We need to improve the speed at which we grow our people. We need to improve the speed at which we go to grow our customers. So how quickly can you make a new start person begin and get them into a position to get them into your business to make them a hero? And this is about making sure that training is on demand and that we think very differently about the new world. You know what, man? I can click play on Netflix and the button can happen straight away. But how come I can't come into your organization and press one button and watch the video about what it actually takes to be able to sell the USPs, the unique selling propositions, or what fundamentally makes your brand great? At the end of the day, how do you increase the intelligence of your staff around the business and its USPs? You get serious about making the decision to add digital training, to add fuel to the fire, in addition to your live in-training experiences. USPs operate at so many different levels, whether or not it be a brand level, an office level, and an individual level, and this stuff doesn't just happen, it's about you creating the education piece around it. A strength is only a strength if you use it. You need to amplify what works. You need to make better data-driven decisions, and at the end of the day, the future depends on what we do here in the present. It's been fascinating to work with you today. I hope that you leave today's session feeling energized, feeling motivated, but most importantly, with some of the biggest questions unanswered, so you can stay focused about what you need to do next in the discovery phase to take your business into the digital era and to do some incredible things with it to fundamentally make it a better quality customer experience and to drive word of mouth marketing. Thank you so much to the team at Dezrez, and we wish you success for the rest of today's conference.